The family was bursting at the seams at the Canoga Park house. Charlie decided that the Yellow Submarine house was too overcrowded, wrote Diane, and the tension was palpable. He sent Squeaky to Spahn Ranch in late February to cozy up with George and convince him to let them return. Squeaky and Manson both believed that when George died, he'd will the property to her. Meanwhile, Brooks and Juanita were at Barker Ranch. That spring, a powerful new influence arrived in the desert to compete with Manson's sway over his followers. According to Juanita, they were supposed to get us in 10 days, but nobody had ever come back from Spahn's. We were there alone when Paul Crockett and Bob Berry showed up. They pulled up to the farmhouse, and it was difficult for us to either invite them in or send them away. We couldn't do either. Paul said that was his first clue that we were under the influence of mind control. We didn't know how to think for ourselves or make decisions for ourselves at all. We came out and told them that the place was taken. But Brooks and Juanita had little in the way of provisions, which melted their standoffishness. Paul and Bob were gold prospectors, but Crockett was also familiar with cults. As Juanita explained, Crockett had studied with one of the first 5 people that L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, had studied with himself. This man had known Ron Hubbard when he used to say things like, "Well, you know how to really make it in this world is to start your own religion. Nobody can touch you, and you can really do it." That man told Paul the reason he wasn't a Scientologist was that he didn't like the amount of control that was happening in that organization. Crockett, in fact, was a self-proclaimed expert at deprogramming. Paul essentially deprogrammed Brooks and me, Juanita said. He talked about the way Charlie got control over everybody by getting people to agree that he was something spectacular and agree to his other self-serving ideas. He said that agreements are much more powerful than people realize they are, and that implied agreements are more powerful than overt agreements. It was those implied agreements that were making it very difficult for us to break away from him. Paul, Brooks, and I used to stay up until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning just talking, doing what were early Scientology experiments. I don't know whether they're still done. I don't know anything about Scientology now at all, other than the fact that Paul has warned me not to get involved with them because they are as hard to get away from as Charlie was. Charlie himself cribbed notes from Scientology. In fact, his phrase, "cease to exist," was actually a Scientology term. While Manson waited for approval to return to Spahn, he found another location to temporarily crash. Per Diane, one of Charlie's friends knew that the group Iron Butterfly was going on tour, and he volunteered to break us into their now vacant mansion. It was near a correctional facility. Charlie had connections everywhere and kept track of them until he completely used up what they could do for him. This house gave us a temporary break, like a calm before a storm, and though it was not as luxurious as Dennis's house, it offered Charlie an opportunity to jam with people through the unwitting kindness of the Iron Butterfly, who left their expensive musical equipment behind. The family stayed at the Iron Butterfly house from late February into early March, and then they got good news. Spahn's son Jim later scolded his dad for his weakness, but George acquiesced to Squeaky's charms. They could come back. Spahn also agreed to act as Owisha's foster parent that month when she was arrested and placed in juvenile hall. Manson kept the Yellow Submarine house in Canoga Park, but shuttled half of the family back to Chatsworth. Yet the ranch had changed, and so had Charlie. Everything was different, Diane remembered. Gone were the whimsical days spent playing dress-up in the movie sets, making love or singing by the campfire. When he wasn't training us, he was poring over massive topographical maps of Death Valley and the surrounding area that he'd managed to accumulate so he could plan different escape routes to the desert. Charlie was singularly focused on these maps, which he had taped together and spread across the floor of the saloon. Like a mad scientist plotting the path to Mars, Charlie insisted there was a direct route from Devil's Canyon to Death Valley. He spent hours studying the maps, so we left him alone and went about our regular chores. When the family returned to Spahn, another communal group were living in the coveted back house. They were the young people formerly at the nearby horse farm, including Jack and Barbara, the parents of young Aaron, the infant that died shortly after his birth in late 1968, and Mr. X, Charlie's favorite LSD dealer, plus a woman named Barbara Bo Rosenberg. Manson began plotting to get them kicked out. One day in spring of 1969, several of the Manson women marched to the back house and spoke to Mr. X, warning him that Manson didn't want him dealing on the ranch. Mr. X never dealt on the ranch and didn't understand the implied threat. Days later, Spahn Ranch was raided by several law enforcement personnel. A jar of green stuff was collected from the kitchen during the raid. The hippies were released from jail, thanks to a woman named Carol among them, whose father was a local sheriff. At a pre-trial hearing, the jar of evidence was introduced. The judge took one sniff, recognized the scent of green tea, and the case was dismissed. But Mr. X soon left the ranch, and so did many of the other hippies, some fleeing north to Oregon. Jack, Barbara, Carol, and Bo Rosenberg stayed behind. We do not know the reason why Manson wanted his LSD dealer gone if he was involved in Mr. X's ouster. This was around the time that Charlie got the bright idea to turn the Longhorn Saloon into a nightclub. The girls went to work decorating, painting the walls, and making the place as trippy as the Black Bus. Away from Manson, Tex Watson's ambitions were growing. I decided to call up an old girlfriend. Her name was Luella, a pseudonym, and I'd gotten to know her casually while Rich and I were still living at the house on the beach. During the week we were waiting for our Army physicals, he'd taken me to see her once, and I felt she'd been especially friendly to me that day. Right now, I needed a friend. I got a lover. The first time I hitchhiked over to her apartment, I ended up moving in. Luella didn't have a real job. She kept herself going by dealing a little grass and LSD among her friends. Nothing big time, but enough to get by. She had an old Hollywood Spanish apartment with eucalyptus trees all around and a patio that overlooked the driveway to an exclusive private club for professional magicians and entertainment stars. Sometimes we'd sunbathe on the deck, drinking beer and smoking grass while we watched all the big limousines drive up for parties, dumping out beautiful people whom we could never quite recognize. It was an easy life that Luella and I fell into. Combining her contacts with mine, we found we could sell a lot more dope than she'd been doing on her own. We charged $15 a lid on grass that we bought from our vending machine friend in $95 kilos, 2.2 pounds, and then broke up into 36 lids. We discovered affluence, a new stereo system, and records. One of the first albums we bought was the Beatles' White Album, and we played it over and over until I knew it by heart. Expensive clothes, clubs, and restaurants where you laid down $5 just for a beer. I even had my hair cut and started getting it styled by a friend I'd known back in my wig shop days. And there were parties. As our dealing got more extensive, I ended up keeping different batches of grass in numbered olive jars, since each kilo had its own distinct taste and high. And when people came over to party, we'd give them a choice. Eventually all the way from number 1 to number 8. I made a gigantic bong, a water pipe, out of some bamboo that grew on the property. As we'd sit around that huge pipe, sucking the water-smooth smoke of some choice Colombian gold, I'd lean back and tell myself that this was really the life. Whatever had made me think I wanted to spend my time out in the hills someplace with Charlie telling me what to do. Yet every time I turned around, I'd be reminded of him. It certainly sounds like Watson thought of himself as a drug dealer. Just a few months later, he and Luella, real name Rosina Kroner, would aim for a big score with disastrous effects. Watson wrote, "The people we met, the people we sold to and partied with, seemed to fit what Charlie had told us about how people, especially Hollywood types, really were. It was as if everyone I came in contact with and everywhere I went, Charlie had already been there before, already met them and laid it all out for me. The shallowness, the plastic, the willingness to rip you off, the concern with masks and self and money. Sometimes I felt as though he were always with me, thinking my thoughts for me or his through me. Every situation seemed to bring up some fragment of Charlie's gospel, and sometimes I'd feel ashamed for letting my ego come to life again so easily, for getting caught in money and things so quickly." He also had woman troubles. Luella had fallen in love with me. After what I'd experienced in the family, I wasn't ready to limit myself to one woman, and although I thought I probably loved her, I couldn't mean it in the exclusive way that she did. I kept seeing and sleeping with other girls. I finally convinced her to start dating other guys as well, but she was never happy about it, not even when I tried using some of Charlie's lines on her. Except for improving her drug business, it seemed that I was pretty much bad news for Luella. After we'd been together for a while, she had to go to Mexico for an abortion that was messed up so badly, she ended up spending a week at the UCLA Medical Center. Then, when I decided to show her a special good time, just for the two of us, and took her on a trip down through Mexico and back up to Palm Springs, we got caught in a dust storm in the desert, and I smashed her VW into the back of a truck. The car was totaled, and she got a bad gash on her head, but she didn't throw me out. Rather than admitting that he fucked up and didn't have the cojones to be the big mofo dealer he imagined himself as, Watson wants us to believe that Charles Manson was controlling him from afar. He'd seen the world I was living in, and he'd warned me, and I found it just what he'd said it would be. Even though a part of me liked it, enjoyed all the things I'd been denying myself, it wouldn't work. I couldn't make it work. 9 months with the family had made too deep a mark on me. Finally, one day I picked up the phone and called the ranch. Even before I dialed, I think I decided to go back to Charlie. 9 months is a stretch since Tex only lived with the family from either July or August until early December of 1968. He returned in March of '69. Watson came back during the time that the nightclub was open. He had changed in the months since he had seen Manson and the others. I appeared at Spahn Ranch with my styled hair and my silk shirt and leather jacket, and I felt there were two of me standing there, the old Tex, whom Charlie and the girls were so glad to see, and Charles from Hollywood, noticing the dust that was getting on his expensive leather shoes. That night I saw the club. It was one of the old ranch buildings, painted all black inside, with a huge parachute covering the ceiling, and black lights and posters, and Helter Skelter and other lines from Beatles songs scrawled all over the walls in luminous paint. There was a large jar in one corner marked donations. That's so we can buy things to get ready for Helter Skelter when it comes down, one of the girls explained. Charlie got up and started performing some new songs of his, things he'd written since I'd left the family 3 months before. I didn't completely understand what was going on, but the new songs seemed to borrow a lot of phrases and ideas from the White Album. They were all about Helter Skelter and being time for someone to rise and someone else to flee to the desert. There was one tune the whole family joined in on, repeating the chorus over and over. You better get your dune buggy ready. You better get your dune buggy ready. Everybody started dancing, Susan, Sadie in the middle of things doing her go-go number, while Charlie and the others sang at the top of their lungs, and the psychedelic posters throbbed with their sickly colors in the black light. I was home. The club was opened only a few evenings when the cops showed up. George Spahn was fined $1,500 as property owner for allowing minors to drink. With Tex back, Manson turned his attention to getting the others in line. Sadie had recovered from her bout with hepatitis, but neither motherhood nor a debilitating social disease had mellowed her. One March day, she showed up at the ranch with several drug dealers. Charlie lost his patience and cut one of them. He was outraged at Sadie for endangering the family and felt inept at protecting them. This coincided with the introduction to a powerful new ally. Recently, Manson had made the acquaintance of several members of the Straight Satans, an outlaw motorcycle club, and he invited them to spend time at the ranch.